If you want an example of how leftist policies destroy an economy and destroy a state, just have a look and go through the data of what Dan Andrews has done to Victoria and how Victoria, after a decade of Dan Andrews, has become an economic wasteland. Now, firstly, let's quickly have a look at this graph here. This shows the massive increase in the number of public servants that Dan Andrews employed as his time. Of course, all those public servants relying on government jobs tend to vote for the government of the day, which is a Labor government. So a great way to win elections, but disastrous long-term for the state. Now you can see here in this graph that while Victoria's population increased 29% between the years 2007, 2008, and 2022-23, from a 29% population increase, they had a 59% increase in the number of public servants. Completely unsustainable. And if you look at the actual cost of employing all these public servants, it's far worse. You can see here in this next graph that if you look at the size of the growth of the economy compared to the wages bill for public service, you can see here, again, every state is terrible figures, but Victoria is the worst of all the states. With a 43% increase in the size of the economy, they've had a massive 152% increase in the wage bill for public servants. Far beyond any other state in the nation. Next, have a look at what that has done, or what Dan Andrews has done to the productivity of Victoria. You can see here in this graph that shows Labor productivity since the GFC, that Victoria has had the worst Labor productivity in the nation. Productivity growth has absolutely collapsed in Victoria. You can see it there in the red line, bottoming out far below the other states of New South Wales, Queensland, and Western Australia. Then the next graph here, this shows the multi-factor productivity growth since the GFC. And again, you can see Victoria, the worst performing state in the nation. Again, far below New South Wales, Queensland, and Western Australia. Productivity has simply collapsed in Victoria. And of course, all this spending on extra public servants to help yourself get re-elected, Labor and Dan Andrews down in Victoria have run up enormous increases in government debt. Now look at this graph you can see here. In 2019, total Victorian government debt was around $58 billion. But by the time we get out to 2024, we're up over $180 billion of gross Victorian debt, and that's forecast to head off in 2027 to over $240 billion in debt that Victoria will owe as the state, far beyond any other state. And then we move on to the next graph that shows the damage that this has done, this increasing debt. This shows net and gross debt per capita by state. And it should be no surprise whatsoever. You can see here that per capita debt in Victoria stood at it's $28,000 per person currently, which is 40% more than the other states. So if you're a Victorian in Victoria, they owe in debt 40% more than any other states. And of course, this has a cost. You've got the servicing cost of the debt. So the current interest bill on Victorian government's debt, thank you, Dan Andrews, is around $4 billion to $5 billion a year. That's the money that has to be paid in interest on the debt that doesn't go to schools or roads or hospitals. And that is set to balloon out to over $9 billion by 26-27, which is the interest payments that the Victorian government have to raise in taxes just to pay the interest on the debt, let alone anything else. And of course, of these interest bills and this debt and this wasteful government spending that Dan Andrews kicked off, you can see here now that Victorians are paying the highest average tax rates in the nation. You can see it here, well above New South Wales now. The highest tax rates in the nation belong, you got it, to Victoria, the poor old Victorian struggling Victorians. Of course, all this big government has a massive effect on the entrepreneurial culture of a state. And you can see in this graph here that entrepreneurs in Victoria have simply almost given up starting new companies. This graph here shows the number of new company registrations per thousand existing companies. And again, you've got Victoria, the lowest in the Commonwealth. You can see well behind there, South Australia, Queensland, New South Wales, and Western Australia. Victoria, again, coming dead last. People, it's killed. Dan Andrews has killed the entrepreneurial drive and culture of that state. And also eventually catches up with you. You can see in this graph here that unemployment is higher in Victoria than any other state in the nation. You can see here, you've got Victoria with an unemployment rate of 4.4%, substantially above every other state that we have in Australia. And of course, it's not just the highest unemployment rate. Victoria also has the lowest growth in wages. And you can see that here in this graph that shows the annual wage growth for the second quarter 2024. The Victorian wage growth has been only 3.3%, below the national average of 4.1%, and below here in New South Wales, an average of 4.2% wage growth. So that simply means Victorians are going backwards faster than anyone else in the nation. And then have a look how Daniel Andrews has turned the Melbourne CBD into a ghost town. Have a look at this graph, which shows office vacancies in the major capital cities of CBD. And you can see here, Melbourne is getting worse. It is now 20% of the office space in Melbourne CBD is vacant. Simply, who wants to start up a business in Victoria? We've got these high rates of taxes, high rates of debt, after years of Daniel Andrews running the government. And this all has a social effect on the state as well. If we see these tragic figures on the fertility rate of Australia, it is Victoria, out of all the states, that has the lowest fertility rate, down to just 1.39. That's births for every woman in the state. At this rate, Victoria is breeding itself out of existence with the lowest fertility rate in the nation. It just shows the despair that people have in Victoria with no confidence in the future. And as the economy collapses in Victoria, thanks to Dan Andrews, we see spiralling crime rates with crime out of control. We see crime increasing everywhere. Car thefts up 23%. Youth crime at a 10-year high. We see graffiti at a 10-year high as well. Retail theft through the roof. People in Victoria simply no longer feel safe. Crime is out of control. The economy is collapsing. It is an economic wasteland, thanks to the policies of Daniel Andrews, the socialist economic policies of Daniel Andrews. But what should be frightening for all Australians is that our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, is copying exactly the same policies of Daniel Andrews.